The most dangerous people in a room are usually the ones nobody bothers listening to. Snow drifted slowly beyond the towering windows of the Grand Lexington Hotel, while Manhattan glowed beneath winter light, like a city trying too hard to look untouchable. Inside the Imperial Ballroom on the 38th floor, wealth moved differently than it did anywhere else in America. Quiet laughter, crystal glasses, expensive watches reflecting chandelier light, conversations soft enough to sound polite and sharp enough to ruin careers. Claire Bennett walked carefully between marble tables carrying a silver tray balanced steadily against one hand, while hundreds of guests filled the ballroom beneath golden light and slow jazz music. She wore a fitted black waitress uniform with silver trim at the collar and her blonde hair tied neatly behind her shoulders. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention, which was exactly why most people never looked at her twice. The annual Hale Foundation Winter Gala attracted politicians, investors, executives, and media figures from across the country every December. Tonight mattered more than usual because Chairman Edward Hale planned to announce a major international partnership expected to change the future of Hale Technologies. At least that was what every financial reporter in the ballroom kept whispering into champagne glasses and private conversations. Claire moved silently between tables while guests discussed billion-dollar contracts like weather forecasts. She noticed patterns more than people now. The executives who smiled before insulting someone. The wives pretending not to notice affairs happening across the ballroom. The assistants carrying entire companies quietly while their bosses collected applause. Wealth taught people how to hide exhaustion behind elegance. Near the center of the ballroom, Victoria Langford sat beside a long table reserved for Hale Technologies board members and foreign investors. Her white diamond necklace sparkled beneath the chandeliers every time she laughed too loudly at her own comments. Claire approached calmly with a bottle of sparkling water balanced beside crystal glasses. "Still water or sparkling tonight, Miss Langford?" Victoria barely glanced at her. "If I wanted recommendations from catering staff, I would ask." A few executives nearby laughed politely into their drinks. Claire nodded once. Of course. She poured the water carefully without reacting. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair while studying Claire with the casual cruelty of someone who had never needed to survive embarrassment. "You know what fascinates me," she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "People who work in places like this always look so serious, as if they secretly think they belong here." More laughter followed. Claire adjusted the bottle cap quietly. "Excuse me." Victoria stopped her before she could leave. "Wait." Claire turned politely. Victoria smiled thinly. "Do you at least know who Edward Hale is?" Claire glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance, where security staff suddenly straightened posture near the doors. "Yes." Victoria smirked. "Good. That saves us one problem tonight." The surrounding table laughed again, while Claire simply nodded and continued walking away beneath the warm chandelier light. She had learned years ago that silence often unsettled arrogant people more than arguments did. Across the ballroom, Edward Hale entered beside two international investors while conversations immediately softened around him. At 63 years old, the chairman carried the kind of presence money could not fully explain. Tall, gray-haired, impossibly calm beneath pressure. People stopped talking when he walked past, not because he demanded attention, but because he rarely wasted words. Claire noticed him immediately while carrying another tray toward the ballroom windows. Edward Hale always noticed details other executives ignored. The placement of silverware, a nervous employee, a delayed response during meetings. Years earlier, those instincts helped him build one of the most powerful technology firms in the country. Tonight, his expression remained unreadable beneath the golden lights, while investors followed closely beside him, discussing European market expansion. Yet as he crossed the ballroom, his eyes briefly lifted toward Claire. Only for a second, but long enough for her to notice. Victoria noticed too. "Interesting," she murmured softly into her champagne glass. Nearby executives turned toward her. Victoria smiled carefully while watching the chairman continue across the room. Edward usually does not acknowledge hotel staff. Claire pretended not to hear while placing fresh glasses near the ballroom stage. The jazz musicians transitioned into softer piano melodies while snow pressed gently against the dark Manhattan windows outside. Around 9 o'clock, The ballroom doors opened again, and several Swiss investors entered, speaking quietly among themselves in German. One younger executive from Hale Technologies rushed nervously toward the translation team near the stage. Claire noticed the panic immediately from across the room. Something had gone wrong already. Edward Hale remained near the center table, speaking with foreign partners, while reporters prepared cameras nearby. Victoria adjusted her diamond bracelet confidently. "Tonight decides everything," she announced proudly toward the surrounding executives. "If this partnership succeeds, Hale Technologies becomes untouchable." Claire passed behind her carrying champagne flutes. Victoria looked up again with visible irritation. "Careful." Claire stopped immediately. "I apologize." Victoria glanced toward the tray. "That glass costs more than your monthly paycheck." The comment drew another wave of quiet laughter around the table. Claire lowered her eyes politely. "Then I will make sure not to drop it." One older executive smirked. "At least she knows her priorities." Claire walked away silently beneath the chandeliers while the laughter faded behind her. Near the ballroom windows, she paused briefly beside the snow-covered skyline and exhaled slowly. The city looked peaceful from 38 floors above Manhattan. Distant headlights moved like rivers beneath white snowfall, while warm ballroom reflections shimmered against the glass beside her. "You never defend yourself." The voice came quietly from behind her. Claire turned calmly. Edward Hale stood several feet away holding a crystal tumbler in one hand, while the ballroom glowed softly behind him. His expression remained unreadable. Claire straightened slightly. "Good evening, Mr. Hale." He studied her carefully for several seconds before speaking again. Most people would have reacted to Victoria by now. Claire glanced toward the ballroom crowd. Most people are trying to win something. Edward's gray eyes narrowed slightly with interest. "And you are not." Claire looked back toward the snowy Manhattan skyline beyond the windows. "No, sir." Silence settled softly between them beneath the chandelier light, while jazz music drifted through the ballroom behind them. Edward Hale continued watching her quietly, as though listening for something hidden underneath the calmness in her voice. Then finally, he gave the smallest nod. "Good." Before Claire could respond, one of the executives hurried urgently toward the chairman from across the ballroom, with visible panic already spreading across his face. And suddenly the atmosphere inside the Imperial Ballroom began changing beneath the falling snow. The atmosphere inside the Imperial Ballroom changed faster than the snowfall outside Manhattan. One moment the room carried the smooth confidence of old money and billion-dollar ambition beneath golden chandeliers. The next, tension began spreading quietly between tables like smoke nobody wanted to acknowledge publicly. Claire Bennett noticed it immediately. Panic always moved differently among wealthy people. They tried to hide it behind lowered voices and controlled expressions, but fear still reached their eyes first. The young executive who rushed toward Edward Hale stopped beside him near the ballroom windows, breathing carefully as if trying not to alarm nearby investors. "Mr. Hale," he whispered urgently, "there is a problem with the Zurich Agreement." Edward remained perfectly still, holding the crystal tumbler in one hand, while jazz music continued softly behind them. "What kind of problem?" The executive swallowed nervously. "The Swiss delegation believes the licensing clause was altered after negotiations closed." Claire lowered her eyes politely and started to step away, but Edward's voice stopped her. "Stay." She paused silently beside the windows while snow drifted against the dark Manhattan skyline outside. The executive continued quietly. "Their lead advisor is demanding clarification before the public announcement." Edward's expression barely changed. "Who reviewed the final translation?" "Daniel Ross." Edward glanced toward the ballroom center, where Daniel stood arguing softly with two legal consultants near the stage. Crystal glasses reflected nervous movement beneath the chandeliers while reporters continued preparing cameras. Unaware the evening stood seconds away from disaster. Claire quietly adjusted the silver tray against her arm while listening without appearing interested. Edward noticed the movement. "You understand German?" he asked suddenly. Claire hesitated briefly. "Some." The executive looked visibly irritated by the interruption. "This is not standard German," he explained quickly. The Swiss legal team used an older Zurich dialect in portions of the agreement. Claire nodded once. "Swiss High German." The executive blinked. "You know the difference?" Claire answered calmly. "The phrasing changes depending on the canton." Edward watched her carefully now beneath the warm chandelier light. Across the ballroom, Victoria Langford approached confidently holding a champagne flute while several executives followed behind her. "Edward," she said smoothly, "the press team is asking when you want the announcement to begin." Then she noticed Claire standing nearby, and her expression cooled immediately. "Why is catering staff included in executive conversations?" Edward ignored the question. "Victoria, there may be an issue with the Zurich agreement." Her smile disappeared. "What kind of issue?" The nervous executive explained quickly while nearby board members slowly gathered closer. Victoria crossed her arms sharply. "That is impossible. Legal approved every document." Daniel Ross finally hurried toward them through the ballroom crowd, carrying a leather folder beneath one arm. "Mr. Hale, I can explain." Edward extended his hand calmly. "Show me the clause." Daniel opened the folder quickly while snow pressed harder against the windows behind them. The ballroom music continued softly, though conversations around nearby tables had begun fading into nervous silence. Edward studied the document beneath the amber light. His jaw tightened slightly. Victoria leaned closer. "What does it say?" Daniel answered carefully. "The Swiss side believes the wording changes intellectual property ownership after the merger period." Victoria looked horrified. "That could destroy the entire agreement." Edward remained silent for several seconds. Then unexpectedly his eyes lifted toward Claire again. "Read it." The surrounding executives looked stunned. Victoria almost laughed in disbelief. "Edward." He never looked away from Claire. "Read the clause." Claire set the silver tray gently onto a nearby table before accepting the document carefully. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances beneath the chandeliers, while reporters continued moving through the ballroom unaware of the growing crisis. Victoria folded her arms tighter. "This is absurd." Claire studied the page quietly while snow reflected softly against the glass beside her. The room watched in silence now, not because they trusted her, because they expected embarrassment. Claire's eyes moved steadily across the German text without hesitation. Edward observed every detail of her expression while Daniel Ross shifted nervously beside them. After several seconds, Claire finally spoke softly. "The translation is incorrect." Daniel immediately reacted. "That is impossible." Claire calmly pointed toward one paragraph near the center of the document. "The phrase here does not refer to ownership transfer." Her finger moved lower. "It refers to temporary operational authority during the evaluation period." Victoria frowned sharply. "What difference does that make?" Claire looked toward her politely. "About $400 million. Silence dropped heavily across the ballroom corner beneath the chandeliers. Daniel took the document back quickly. No, Claire remained calm. The legal team translated the phrase literally instead of contextually. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly with growing interest. Claire continued quietly. "Swiss High German legal phrasing changes meaning depending on corporate structure references earlier in the document." Daniel reread the clause rapidly while his face slowly lost color. One of the foreign investors stepped forward speaking softly in German toward Claire. She answered immediately in the same dialect without hesitation. The investor's expression changed instantly from frustration to surprise. Victoria stared at Claire in complete disbelief. "Where did you learn that language?" Claire handed the document back carefully. "Years ago." Edward continued watching her without speaking. Around them, executives whispered nervously while tension spread beneath the ballroom lights. Daniel finally looked up from the contract with visible shock. "She is right." Victoria blinked. "What?" Daniel swallowed carefully. The agreement was mistranslated during revision. Edward's voice remained low and calm. "Can it still be fixed before the announcement?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, but only if we clarify the wording immediately with the Swiss delegation." One of the foreign investors looked directly at Claire now. "You may have just saved this partnership." Claire lowered her eyes modestly. "I only corrected the wording." Victoria stared at her silently beneath the chandeliers, unable to reconcile the quiet waitress carrying silver trays with the woman who just solved a legal disaster nobody else in the room recognized. Edward Hale took the contract folder slowly from Daniel's hands before looking once more toward Claire beneath the warm ballroom lights. His expression revealed nothing openly, but for the first time that evening, the chairman no longer looked at her like hotel staff. He looked at her like someone he had been waiting to hear speak. Silence spread differently after intelligence embarrassed powerful people. It became colder, sharper beneath the chandeliers. The imperial ballroom still glowed with warm golden light while jazz drifted softly near the stage. But now conversations carried tension underneath every polished smile. Claire Bennett quietly lifted her silver tray again after correcting the translation error, while executives surrounded Edward Hale near the ballroom windows discussing emergency revisions to the Zurich Agreement. Nobody laughed anymore, especially Victoria Langford. She stood beside the chairman, holding her untouched champagne glass too tightly, while Daniel Ross rushed between legal advisors and foreign investors attempting to repair the misunderstanding before reporters discovered anything was wrong. Claire returned calmly to work as if nothing important had happened. That unsettled Victoria more than the correction itself. "Excuse me," one guest called softly from a nearby table. Claire approached politely. "Another sparkling water, please." "Of course." She poured carefully while snow reflected against crystal glasses near the windows. Across the ballroom, Edward Hale continued watching her between conversations. Not constantly, quietly, like a man confirming something he already suspected. Victoria noticed every glance. She finally stepped toward him once Daniel hurried away with the revised documents. "Edward." His eyes remained on the ballroom crowd. "What?" Victoria lowered her voice carefully. "You are not seriously impressed by this." Edward finally looked toward her. "By what?" A waitress translating legal phrasing. Her tone sharpened subtly. It was lucky timing. Edward swirled the amber liquid inside his tumbler once before answering. "Luck rarely explains precision." Victoria forced a thin smile. "Still, it is strange." Edward said nothing. Victoria continued quietly. "She acts like she belongs in executive meetings." The chairman's expression remained unreadable beneath the chandelier light. And yet she was the only person in this ballroom who caught the error. Victoria looked away first. Across the room, Claire placed fresh dessert plates near the stage while several guests openly stared now. Some with curiosity, others with visible discomfort. Wealthy people tolerated invisible workers easily. Competent invisible workers made them nervous. One younger investor approached Claire cautiously near the service station. "You really understood all that legal terminology?" Claire adjusted the folded napkins calmly. "Enough." He laughed awkwardly. "That is modest." Claire gave a faint, polite smile. Modesty survives longer in rooms like this. The investor blinked, unsure whether she insulted him or not. Before he could answer, Victoria appeared beside them beneath the warm amber lighting. "Claire, right?" Claire turned politely. "Yes, Ms. Langford." Victoria smiled pleasantly now, though the coldness underneath remained obvious. "Interesting evening for you." "It has been busy." Victoria studied her face carefully. "You know, people usually mention qualifications before correcting senior executives publicly." Claire remained calm. "I was asked to read the document." Victoria's smile tightened slightly. "Yes, about that." She leaned closer. "Do you enjoy making people look foolish?" The younger investor beside them shifted uncomfortably. Claire answered softly. "No." Victoria crossed her arms. "Then perhaps next time you should remember your role before speaking." Claire met her eyes without defensiveness. "Would you have preferred I stayed silent?" Victoria hesitated for half a second too long. Claire noticed. So did the younger investor. Before anyone answered, Edward Hale's voice arrived quietly from behind them. "No." The small group turned immediately. The chairman stood beneath the chandeliers holding his crystal tumbler while snow drifted beyond the windows behind him. His expression remained calm, but carried enough authority to freeze movement around the table. Edward looked directly at Victoria. "I would have preferred my executives caught the mistake first." Silence settled sharply around them. Victoria straightened immediately. "Of course." Edward's eyes shifted toward Claire next. "Walk with me." The ballroom subtly quieted as Claire followed the chairman away from the crowd toward the far hallway overlooking Manhattan. Conversations resumed slowly behind them, while Victoria remained standing beside the service station, visibly humiliated beneath the chandelier glow. The hallway beyond the ballroom felt quieter, softer. Snow covered the city below in white light, while distant traffic moved silently 38 floors beneath the windows. Edward stopped beside the glass overlooking the skyline. Claire stood calmly nearby, holding the silver tray against her side. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Edward finally asked, Why are you working here? Claire looked toward the snow outside. I needed work. That is not what I asked. His voice remained low and controlled. Claire stayed silent briefly before answering. Sometimes simpler jobs leave more room to breathe. Edward studied her carefully. You were not always a waitress. Claire almost smiled faintly. No. The chairman took a slow sip from his drink. Swiss legal dialects are not exactly common knowledge in hospitality work. Claire looked down toward the city lights below Manhattan. People change careers. Edward nodded slightly. Usually not that drastically. The hallway lights reflected softly across polished marble floors, while distant jazz music echoed from the ballroom behind them. Claire finally spoke again. You already know who I am, do not you? Edward never looked surprised by the question. Yes. Claire exhaled quietly. How long? Since the moment you walked into the ballroom. She nodded once as though confirming something privately to herself. Edward continued watching the snowfall beyond the glass. I was curious how long you intended to stay invisible. Claire's expression softened almost sadly. Invisible people hear the truth faster. Edward glanced toward her. And what truth did you hear tonight? Claire looked back toward the ballroom doors where executives continued scrambling behind polished smiles and expensive suits. Most people in that room are terrified. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly with interest. Of what? Claire answered calmly. Being exposed as less capable than they pretend to be. Silence settled gently between them while snow continued falling across Manhattan outside. Edward slowly smiled for the first time that evening. Not warmly. Respectfully. You always did notice patterns faster than everyone else. Claire lowered her eyes briefly after hearing the word always. Before she could respond, Daniel Ross suddenly hurried into the hallway carrying revised documents beneath one arm. Mr. Hale, he said breathlessly, the Swiss delegation agreed to continue negotiations. Edward nodded once. Good. Daniel hesitated awkwardly before glancing toward Claire. Also, he swallowed carefully. Their lead advisor specifically requested she attend the private discussion upstairs. Claire's expression remained unreadable. Edward looked toward her quietly beneath the warm hallway light. It seems, he said softly, you are no longer invisible tonight. The private conference room above the Imperial Ballroom felt colder than the celebration downstairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked snowy Manhattan, while muted city lights reflected across the polished black table at the center of the room. The warmth of jazz music and chandelier light no longer reached this high inside the Grand Lexington Hotel. Here, conversations carried consequences. Claire Bennett stood quietly near the far end of the conference table, still wearing her black waitress uniform, while senior executives from Hale Technologies reviewed revised legal documents with visible tension. Several Swiss investors sat across from them, speaking softly in German, while translators adjusted headsets and legal consultants flipped urgently through binders. Nobody in the room seemed comfortable with Claire's presence except Edward Hale. The chairman sat near the center of the table beneath soft amber, lighting with both hands folded calmly in front of him, while snow drifted beyond the glass behind him. He looked completely composed, which usually meant everyone else should worry more. Victoria Langford remained seated 2 chairs away, visibly irritated every time Claire spoke to one of the Swiss advisors. Daniel Ross stood beside a digital presentation screen, trying to regain control of the meeting after the ballroom disaster downstairs. The corrected language now reflects temporary oversight authority only, Daniel explained carefully while displaying revised clauses across the screen. One Swiss investor adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. And intellectual ownership remains with both parties during the evaluation phase? Daniel nodded immediately. Correct. The investor looked toward Claire instead of Daniel. She gave a small confirming nod. Only then did the investor relax slightly in his chair. Victoria noticed. So did everyone else. The room had shifted. Quietly. Permanently. Claire remained near the windows holding a leather folder Daniel handed her earlier. She never interrupted. Never inserted herself into conversations unnecessarily. Yet every time confusion surfaced around the Swiss terminology, eyes drifted toward her automatically now. Competence changed power dynamics faster than titles ever could. One of the younger board members finally leaned back in his chair and asked what everyone else clearly wanted to know. How exactly does a waitress become fluent in Swiss legal dialects? The room fell silent beneath the soft conference lighting. Claire looked down briefly at the folder in her hands. I studied international finance years ago. Victoria folded her arms immediately. Studied where? Claire answered calmly. Columbia. Several executives exchanged surprised glances. The younger board member blinked. You attended Columbia University? Yes. Victoria laughed softly beneath her breath. Interesting career transition. Edward Hale finally spoke without raising his voice. Claire graduated top of her program. The silence after that sentence felt heavier than before. Daniel slowly looked toward Claire with visible confusion. One Swiss advisor lowered his pen completely. Victoria stared directly at Edward now. You knew? Edward's expression never changed. Yes. Victoria leaned back sharply in her chair. Then why is she working downstairs carrying champagne? Claire remained quiet. Edward answered instead. Because she chose to. Snow pressed softly against the towering windows while city lights flickered far below Manhattan beneath the winter storm. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The executives around the table suddenly looked uncomfortable in a different way now. Earlier they dismissed Claire because they assumed ignorance. Now they were forced to confront something worse. They underestimated someone intelligent because they decided her uniform mattered more than her mind. Daniel finally cleared his throat carefully. Claire. She looked toward him politely. Why leave finance? Her eyes lowered briefly toward the city below before answering. I stopped liking who people became around money. Victoria smirked faintly. And hospitality is better? Claire almost smiled. People are more honest when they think you are beneath them. Edward watched her closely after that sentence. Not surprised. Reflective. Like someone hearing familiar truth spoken aloud. One of the Swiss advisors suddenly leaned forward. You worked in Zurich before, yes? Claire nodded once. For a short time. Victoria looked increasingly frustrated by the conversation slipping away from her control. What firm? Claire hesitated briefly. Edward answered quietly before she could. Kessler and Braun. Several executives immediately looked stunned. Daniel almost dropped the pen in his hand. That is one of the most competitive financial advisory firms in Europe. Claire remained silent. Victoria stared at Edward in disbelief. How do you know all this? The chairman slowly lifted his crystal water glass beneath the amber light. Because I interviewed her personally 6 years ago. Silence crashed across the room. Snow continued drifting outside while the conference lights reflected softly against the black marble table. Daniel looked between them with visible confusion. You interviewed Claire Bennett. Edward nodded once. For Hale Technologies' Strategic Analysis Division. Victoria's expression hardened immediately. Then why is she not working for us? Nobody answered right away. Claire looked toward the windows while distant Manhattan traffic glowed beneath snowfall below. Finally, she spoke softly. Because my father got sick. The room quieted further. I left New York to take care of him. Daniel lowered his eyes slightly. Claire continued calmly. After he passed away, I never returned to finance. Victoria crossed her arms again, though less confidently now. You walked away from that career to become hotel staff. Claire looked toward her without defensiveness. I walked away because I was tired. Edward's eyes never left her face. You disappeared without explanation. Claire nodded faintly. Yes. One older Swiss advisor studied her thoughtfully across the table. Mr. Hale speaks very highly of your work. Victoria turned sharply toward Edward. You kept track of her? Edward answered calmly. Some people are difficult to replace. The sentence settled quietly through the conference room beneath the soft lights and falling snow. Claire looked down at the leather folder in her hands while something unreadable passed briefly across her expression. Not pride, not regret, something quieter. Daniel slowly sat down beside the screen, looking completely overwhelmed now. Wait, he frowned. If Mr. Hale trusted you that much, why did nobody here know who you were tonight? Edward finally leaned back in his chair and looked toward the dark Manhattan skyline beyond the windows before answering softly. Because Claire Bennett asked me for one thing when she returned to New York. The room remained completely still. Edward's voice lowered slightly. She asked to be left alone. Victoria stared silently across the table while realization finally settled across the faces around her. The quiet waitress they mocked downstairs had once been trusted personally by the most powerful man in the room. And somehow she never once used that fact to defend herself. The conference room remained quiet long after Edward Hale revealed the truth. Snow continued drifting across Manhattan outside the towering windows while the city lights below looked blurred beneath the storm, softer somehow than the atmosphere inside the Grand Lexington Hotel. Claire Bennett stood near the far end of the polished table, still holding the leather folder against her side, while executives struggled to reconcile the woman they mocked downstairs with the person now sitting at the center of their billion-dollar crisis. Nobody spoke carelessly anymore. Respect had entered the room quietly, but humiliation entered with it. Victoria Langford adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist for the third time in less than a minute while avoiding direct eye contact with Claire. Daniel Ross sat beside the digital presentation screen rereading revised contract clauses, although the legal issue had already been solved. Sometimes people pretended to stay busy because shame felt easier while moving. Edward Hale finally stood from his chair beneath the soft amber lighting. "The corrected agreement will be signed privately before midnight," he announced calmly. "Public statements remain scheduled for tomorrow morning." Several executives nodded immediately. One Swiss advisor closed his binder with visible relief. "Then we have no further objections." Edward extended his hand politely across the table. "Good." The room slowly began relaxing for the first time all evening. Chairs shifted softly against polished floors while legal teams gathered documents and translators removed headsets. Claire quietly stepped toward the door, intending to leave unnoticed before the atmosphere turned awkward again. "Claire." Edward's voice stopped her immediately. She turned calmly. The chairman looked toward the empty chair beside him. "Sit for a moment." The room fell subtly silent again. Claire hesitated before slowly taking the seat beside him at the long black conference table. Victoria visibly stiffened watching the scene unfold. Edward rested both hands together calmly beneath the warm lights, while snow reflected softly across the glass behind him. "There is something this room deserves to understand." Nobody interrupted. Edward rarely explained himself twice. He looked toward the executives first. 6 years ago, Hale Technologies nearly lost a European infrastructure acquisition because our internal forecasting models failed. Daniel frowned slightly. "The Bremer account." Edward nodded once. Every senior analyst on the project approved projections that were fundamentally flawed. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Edward continued quietly. Claire Bennett was 28 years old at the time. Claire lowered her eyes slightly toward the table. She reviewed the models overnight and found an error nobody else caught. Victoria finally spoke carefully. "What kind of error?" Edward looked toward the snowy skyline before answering. "Human behavior." The room stayed silent. Edward's expression softened slightly with memory. Every analyst focused on numbers. Claire noticed cultural instability inside regional leadership structures that could collapse the merger within 18 months. One Swiss investor leaned forward with visible interest now. Edward continued. "She was right." Daniel looked stunned. "That decision saved the company billions." Edward nodded calmly. "And protected thousands of employees from layoffs." The room became very still beneath the conference lights. Claire said nothing. She never once interrupted the story, even though every person around the table now stared at her differently than before. Edward finally looked directly toward Victoria. The executives who mocked her tonight would not currently have positions at Hale Technologies without her work. Victoria's face lost color beneath the warm amber lighting. She opened her mouth briefly before closing it again. No defense sounded intelligent anymore. Claire quietly folded her hands together near the leather folder while snow continued drifting outside. One older board member finally cleared his throat awkwardly. "Then why was her contribution never publicized?" Edward answered before Claire could. "Because she refused recognition." Several people blinked in surprise. Edward almost smiled faintly. Claire believed the company mattered more than her ego. Silence settled heavily after that sentence. In rooms filled with power, humility always sounded louder than arrogance. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair, studying Claire carefully now. "You could have built an extraordinary career." Claire looked toward the city lights below Manhattan. "I already had one." "And you walked away from it." Her voice remained soft. "Success means less when your family needs you more." Nobody in the room laughed anymore. Nobody looked at her uniform. The waitress they dismissed downstairs now carried something far more valuable than status. Perspective. Edward watched her quietly beneath the chandelier, glow spilling faintly through the conference room doorway. Your father would have been proud tonight. Claire's eyes lowered for the first time with visible emotion. Just slightly. Thank you. Victoria suddenly stood from her chair, unable to remain seated beneath the growing weight of the room. I should return downstairs, she announced stiffly. Edward nodded once without stopping her. But before Victoria reached the door, Claire spoke softly behind her. Ms. Langford. Victoria paused immediately. Slowly she turned back toward the table. Claire's expression remained calm. Kind even now. You were not wrong earlier. Victoria frowned slightly. About what? Claire glanced briefly toward her waitress uniform. Most people do not expect someone dressed like this to belong in rooms like these. Victoria stared silently. Claire continued gently. That is why listening matters. The sentence landed quietly across the room without accusation. No anger. No revenge. Somehow that made the humiliation sharper. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly before leaving the conference room without another word. The door closed softly behind her, while snowfall continued thickening outside the Manhattan skyline. One Swiss advisor smiled faintly toward Claire after a long silence. In Zurich, he said carefully, there is an old saying. Claire looked toward him politely. He folded his hands together. The quietest person at the table is often the one carrying the most truth. Edward's expression softened almost invisibly. Claire looked down briefly at the polished black table before answering. Sometimes silence is easier than explaining yourself to people who already decided who you are. Nobody argued with her. Because every person in that room suddenly realized they had done exactly that the moment they saw her carrying a silver tray beneath the ballroom chandeliers downstairs. And now, with snow falling softly beyond the windows of Manhattan and billion-dollar contracts resting safely on the table between them, the most powerful executives in the building sat quietly listening to the woman they once ignored. By the time the conference room meeting ended, midnight had almost reached Manhattan. Snow covered the city in thick white layers beyond the towering hotel windows, while the lights below looked softer beneath the storm, like New York itself had grown quieter overnight. Inside the Grand Lexington Hotel, the Imperial Ballroom had nearly emptied. Most reporters already left after receiving carefully controlled statements from Hale Technologies executives downstairs. The jazz musicians packed away instruments beneath dimmed chandeliers, while hotel staff quietly folded linens and cleared crystal glasses from marble tables. Claire Bennett stepped out of the elevator alone, carrying her black coat folded over one arm. The silence inside the ballroom felt different now than earlier that evening. Before, people ignored her because they considered her invisible. Now the room felt careful around her, respectful in an uncertain way. Claire walked slowly toward the service station near the ballroom windows where several employees quietly organized trays and silverware for closing procedures. One younger waitress immediately straightened when she saw her. Claire. Her voice lowered nervously. Everybody downstairs is talking about you. Claire gave a faint, tired smile. That usually means something went wrong. The younger waitress laughed softly before hesitating. Victoria Langford asked management for your employee file earlier. Claire continued folding linen napkins calmly. I assumed she would. Are you worried? Claire glanced toward the snowy skyline outside the ballroom windows. No, across the nearly empty ballroom. Edward Hale entered quietly from the hallway, without security or executives surrounding him for the first time all night. He carried his dark overcoat folded over one arm, while the soft amber chandelier light reflected against the silver watch resting beneath his cuff. Several hotel employees immediately lowered their voices after noticing him. Edward walked directly toward Claire. Not rushed, not formal, just deliberate. Claire noticed him approaching before he spoke. Mr. Hale. He stopped beside the service station while snow drifted behind them through the glass. You should stop calling me that. Claire looked at him calmly. You are still the chairman. Edward almost smiled faintly. And you are still avoiding every conversation that matters. The younger waitress nearby quietly disappeared toward the kitchen, pretending not to listen. Claire folded another napkin carefully before answering. Some conversations create more complications than peace. Edward rested both hands lightly against the polished counter beside her. You think disappearing solved things? Claire remained silent for several seconds. Then finally she looked toward him beneath the warm ballroom light. My father was dying. Edward's expression softened immediately. Claire continued quietly. Finance stopped matching. Snow pressed softly against the windows while distant Manhattan traffic glowed far below the 38th floor. Edward lowered his voice slightly. You could have returned after. Claire shook her head once. I did not want that life anymore. Edward studied her face carefully. Or maybe you were angry. Claire's eyes lowered briefly toward the folded linens beneath her hands. I was exhausted. The chairman remained silent after hearing that. Sometimes powerful people confused ambition with happiness because nobody around them dared admit the difference. Claire finally looked toward the ballroom floor, where hotel employees quietly extinguished candles table by table beneath the chandeliers. Do you know what I remember most about working in finance? Edward waited patiently. Nobody ever stopped running. Her voice stayed calm. Not after promotions. Not after bonuses. Not after success. She looked back toward him softly. People just kept sacrificing themselves for rooms full of strangers who forgot their names the next quarter. Edward exhaled slowly beneath the warm amber lighting. You always noticed the human cost faster than the numbers. Claire gave the faintest smile. Somebody needed to. Silence settled gently between them while snow continued falling across Manhattan outside. Then Edward reached into the inner pocket of his coat and removed a small white envelope before placing it carefully on the polished service counter beside her folded linens. Claire looked at it but did not touch it. What is that? An offer? Her expression barely changed. For what? Edward answered calmly. Your old office still exists at Hale Technologies. Claire looked away immediately toward the windows. No. Edward seemed unsurprised by the answer. You did not even open it. I already know what it says. He studied her quietly. You belong in rooms where your mind matters. Claire finally looked back toward him. My mind matters here too. The sentence stopped him briefly. Claire glanced toward the younger hotel employees cleaning tables beneath the dim ballroom lights. These people treat me like a person. Edward followed her gaze silently. Claire continued softly. Nobody here cares about quarterly earnings or stock performance. They ask if I slept enough. They bring me coffee when my shift runs late. Her eyes lowered thoughtfully. That matters more than titles. Edward stood quietly beside her beneath the chandeliers while the ballroom lights dimmed section by section around them. For the first time all evening, the chairman looked tired instead of powerful, human instead of untouchable. Do you know why I trusted you most back then? He asked softly. Claire said nothing. Edward looked out toward the snowy skyline. Because everyone else in those boardrooms wanted to impress me. His eyes returned toward her calmly. You were the only person willing to disappoint me if the truth required it. Claire remained very still after hearing that. The ballroom around them had almost emptied completely now except for a few hotel employees quietly finishing cleanup beneath the fading chandelier glow. Edward continued quietly. People like Victoria spend their entire lives trying to sound important. His expression softened faintly. You never needed to. Claire lowered her eyes toward the unopened envelope resting beside the folded linens. I am not the same person I was 6 years ago. Edward nodded once. Neither am I. Snow continued falling silently beyond the windows while Manhattan glowed beneath the winter storm below them. Finally, Claire picked up the white envelope but held it gently without opening it. Edward watched her carefully. That is not pressure, he said quietly. It is only possibility. Claire looked toward him beneath the warm ballroom light. You still trust me that much? Edward's answer came without hesitation. More than most people sitting on my executive floor. Silence settled softly between them one last time while hotel staff extinguished the final candles near the ballroom stage. And somewhere beneath the fading jazz music, polished marble floors, and falling Manhattan snow, Claire Bennett realized the most difficult thing about being seen again was not pride. It was deciding whether she was ready to stop hiding. The storm over Manhattan grew heavier after midnight. Snow covered the streets below the Grand Lexington Hotel in thick white silence, while traffic lights reflected softly across frozen pavement like distant embers beneath the winter dark. Inside the Imperial Ballroom, the final hotel employees completed cleanup beneath dim chandelier light, while most of the city's wealthiest guests disappeared into chauffeured cars and private elevators hours ago. Claire Bennett stood alone near the ballroom windows holding the unopened white envelope Edward Hale gave her earlier. The skyline beyond the glass looked blurred beneath falling snow while warm reflections from the ballroom lights shimmered faintly beside her. She still had not opened the envelope. Part of her already knew why. Because once possibilities returned, so did memories she worked very hard to bury quietly. Behind her, silverware clinked softly into storage bins while hotel staff prepared to close the ballroom for the night. Claire slipped the envelope carefully into her coat pocket and exhaled slowly toward the snowy skyline outside. You always stare at the city like it owes you answers. Claire turned immediately at the familiar voice. Daniel Ross approached, holding 2 paper coffee cups beneath the dim amber lighting. His suit jacket hung loosely over one shoulder now, and exhaustion softened the sharp executive confidence he carried earlier that evening. Claire accepted the coffee quietly. Thank you. Daniel leaned beside her near the windows overlooking Manhattan. I figured nobody else in this building is sleeping tonight. Claire gave a faint smile into the steam rising from the cup. Probably not. Snow continued falling heavily across the skyline, while silence settled briefly between them. Finally, Daniel looked toward her carefully. You could have told us who you were. Claire's eyes remained on the city below. Would it have changed how people behaved? Daniel hesitated. Maybe. Claire shook her head softly. No. It only would have changed how politely they pretended. The answer stayed with him for several seconds. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the marble floor beneath them. Victoria feels terrible. Claire almost smiled faintly. Victoria feels embarrassed. Daniel laughed quietly despite himself. Fair point. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly further as hotel management shut down another section of the room for closing. Shadows stretched longer across marble floors while the chandeliers glowed softer, now above nearly empty tables. Daniel looked toward Claire again. Edward really trusted you back then. Claire nodded once. He trusted honesty. No, Daniel shook his head carefully. He trusted you specifically. Claire remained silent. Daniel continued thoughtfully. I have worked beside Edward Hale for 11 years. He does not defend people publicly unless they matter to him. Snow pressed against the windows behind them, while distant sirens echoed faintly through Manhattan below. Claire lowered her voice slightly. Your world does not leave much room for mistakes. Daniel studied her expression carefully. Neither does yours. She almost laughed softly at that. Hospitality is simpler. Daniel looked around the enormous ballroom beneath the fading lights. Tonight did not look simple. Claire glanced toward the folded service linens near the stage. People reveal themselves faster when they believe you cannot affect their future. Daniel nodded slowly as understanding settled deeper across his face. That is why you stayed quiet. Claire finally looked toward him directly. Powerful people speak constantly because they are terrified silence will make them irrelevant. Her eyes softened faintly. People with nothing left to prove usually stop talking so much. Before Daniel could respond, the ballroom doors opened quietly behind them. Edward Hale stepped back inside alone, wearing his dark overcoat now buttoned against the winter cold outside. Snowflakes melted slowly across his shoulders beneath the chandelier glow. Claire immediately noticed something different in his expression. Not authority. Fatigue. Real fatigue. Edward approached them calmly, while Daniel straightened slightly. The Swiss delegation left? Daniel asked. Edward nodded once. Agreement finalized. He looked toward Claire afterward. Officially. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. That is good. Edward studied her for a long moment beneath the warm amber lighting. Then unexpectedly he reached into his coat pocket and removed an old silver fountain pen before placing it gently onto the polished marble table beside them. Claire froze instantly after seeing it. Daniel looked confused. What is that? Edward never looked away from Claire. Recognition. Claire stared silently at the pen beneath the chandelier light, while snow drifted beyond the ballroom windows. Her voice softened almost immediately. You still kept it? Edward nodded once. You left it in the boardroom the night you resigned. Daniel frowned slightly. Why does it matter? Edward answered quietly. Because Claire used this pen to sign the recommendation that prevented Hale Technologies from acquiring Bremer International. Daniel blinked slowly. The deal that saved the company. Edward nodded again. Claire carefully picked up the silver pen with both hands now. The metal felt colder than she remembered. Her father gave it to her the day she graduated from Columbia University. For years she believed she lost it forever. I thought it was gone, she whispered softly. Edward's expression gentled almost invisibly. Some things are worth keeping. Silence settled heavily between them beneath the fading ballroom lights. Daniel looked between the two of them with growing realization now. Wait. His eyes narrowed slightly. Edward knew you were working here this entire time, did not he? Claire slowly looked toward the chairman. Edward answered calmly. Yes. Daniel looked stunned. You let her work downstairs serving drinks while half the city walked past her every night. Edward's eyes remained on Claire. Because she asked for peace. The ballroom grew quiet again except for distant wind pressing snow against the towering windows. Daniel looked overwhelmed now. And you never told anyone. Edward's voice lowered gently. Some people survive because nobody expects anything from them anymore. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the silver pen, while emotion flickered briefly across her face beneath the amber chandelier glow. Not sadness exactly. Recognition. Edward continued softly. But silence has a cost too. Claire looked toward him carefully. What cost? Edward glanced toward the nearly dark ballroom around them. Eventually people forget how extraordinary you really are. The sentence lingered quietly through the empty ballroom, while snow continued falling beyond the Manhattan skyline. Claire lowered her eyes toward the silver pin resting carefully in her hands. And for the first time in years, the life she buried beneath waitress uniforms, folded linens, and quiet invisibility no longer felt completely unreachable. By 1:30 in the morning, the Grand Lexington Hotel had almost fallen completely silent. Snow covered Manhattan in thick white stillness beyond the towering ballroom windows, while the city lights below flickered softly beneath the winter storm like distant reflections trapped beneath ice. Inside the Imperial Ballroom, only a few dim chandeliers still remained lit above polished marble floors and empty tables where some of the most powerful people in America laughed and judged each other only hours earlier. Claire Bennett sat alone near the ballroom windows now wearing her dark wool coat, while the old silver fountain pen rested quietly between her hands atop the table. Edward Hale had already left to finalize the last legal signatures upstairs with the Swiss delegation, and Daniel Ross disappeared nearly 20 minutes earlier after receiving another emergency call from the executive floor. For the first time all evening, Claire finally sat in complete silence. Real silence. No ballroom music. No whispered conversations. No executives pretending confidence behind expensive smiles. Just snow falling quietly beyond the glass and the faint hum of Manhattan beneath the storm. Claire slowly turned the silver pen between her fingers beneath the chandelier glow. Her father used to keep it in the front pocket of his suit jacket every Sunday when they attended church together outside Boston years ago. He always believed objects carried memory better than photographs did. Because people pose for photographs, he once told her. But objects stay honest. Claire closed her eyes briefly while the memory settled quietly inside her chest. For years, she buried entire pieces of herself because survival sometimes required becoming smaller than who you once were. Simpler, invisible, safer. The ballroom doors opened softly behind her. Claire expected another hotel employee finishing cleanup, but instead Olivia Hale stepped quietly into the nearly dark ballroom, carrying her shoes in one hand. Edward Hale's daughter looked exhausted beneath the fading chandelier lights, her formal black dress slightly wrinkled from the long evening. She stopped after noticing Claire sitting alone near the windows. Oh, Olivia smiled apologetically. I thought everyone left already. Claire returned the faint smile. Almost. Olivia walked closer slowly while snow continued falling behind the glass beyond them. Unlike most people connected to wealth, Olivia carried very little arrogance around her. Years of watching powerful men destroy themselves through ambition made her quieter than expected. My father told me about tonight, she said softly. Claire looked down toward the silver pen again. I assumed the story became larger than necessary. Olivia laughed quietly. At Hale Technologies, everything becomes larger than necessary. Claire almost smiled. Olivia noticed the pen immediately. I remember that. Claire looked up. Olivia sat carefully across from her, beneath the warm chandelier glow. You used to carry it during meetings. Claire nodded once. My father gave it to me. Olivia studied her thoughtfully for several seconds before speaking again. Do you know something strange? Claire remained quiet. Olivia glanced around the empty ballroom. You are the first person I have seen make my father look calm in years. Snow drifted softly outside while the dim ballroom lights reflected against the windows beside them. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Your father carries more pressure than people realize. Olivia smiled sadly. He also carries more loneliness. The sentence lingered quietly between them. Claire looked toward the empty ballroom floor, where hotel employees extinguished the final candles near the stage. Olivia continued softly. After my mother died, work became the only thing he trusted completely. Claire listened silently. He stopped letting people close enough to disappoint him. Olivia's expression softened slightly beneath the amber lighting. Except you. Claire immediately shook her head gently. No, Olivia smiled faintly. You disappeared on him once already. Claire looked away toward the snowy skyline. That was different. Olivia studied her carefully now. Was it? Silence settled softly around them, while snow continued covering Manhattan beyond the towering windows. Finally, Claire spoke quietly. Your father trusted my mind. Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair. No, her voice lowered gently. My father trusted your honesty. Claire did not answer immediately. Somewhere in the nearly empty ballroom, distant silverware clinked softly as hotel staff completed closing procedures beneath fading chandelier light. Olivia continued carefully. People spend their entire careers trying to impress him. Her eyes shifted toward the silver pin resting on the table. You were willing to disagree with him publicly if it protected the company. Claire finally looked toward her again. That does not make me special. Olivia almost laughed softly. In his world, she shook her head. It absolutely does. The ballroom fell quiet again afterward while snow pressed softly against the glass. Then Olivia's expression changed slightly, becoming more serious now. Victoria is trying to find a way to remove Daniel from the Zurich project. Claire frowned faintly. Why? Because embarrassment makes insecure people dangerous. Olivia folded her hands together atop the table. Tonight damaged her reputation. Claire looked toward the nearly dark ballroom floor thoughtfully. That is not Daniel's fault. Olivia watched her carefully. I know. Claire understood immediately what Olivia was really asking. Whether she intended to stay silent while executives turned against each other again upstairs. Whether she planned to remain invisible even now. Claire slowly picked up the silver fountain pen from the table beneath the chandelier glow while snow continued falling outside Manhattan. Her reflection stared back faintly through the towering windows beside them. Not the exhausted waitress everyone assumed she was downstairs earlier. Not fully the brilliant financial strategist she buried years ago either. Something between both versions now. Older, quieter, stronger in different ways. Olivia finally stood carefully from the table and slipped her shoes back on beneath the warm ballroom light. Before leaving, she paused beside Claire one last time. Do you know why my father trusted you most? Claire looked up slowly. Olivia smiled faintly. Because you never needed power to tell the truth. Then she disappeared quietly through the ballroom doors while the final chandelier lights dimmed softer above the empty marble floor. Claire remained alone beside the snowy Manhattan windows holding the silver pin carefully between her fingers. And somewhere beneath the silence, winter light, and fading reflections across the glass, she realized the hardest part about returning to the world she abandoned was not fear of failure. It was fear that she might belong there again. Morning arrived quietly over Manhattan beneath pale winter light, and streets still covered in untouched snow from the storm overnight. The Grand Lexington Hotel stood glowing softly against the frozen skyline, while Blacktown cars lined the entrance below for the official Hale Technologies press conference scheduled that morning. Inside the executive ballroom on the top floor, reporters adjusted cameras beside polished marble columns, while financial journalists whispered predictions about the Zurich partnership beneath bright chandeliers and television lighting. Nobody in the room realized the most important person connected to the deal had worn a waitress uniform only hours earlier. Claire Bennett stood alone near the private hallway overlooking the city while fastening the silver clasp on a dark navy coat Olivia Hale personally brought her earlier that morning. The old silver fountain pen rested quietly inside her coat pocket beside the unopened white envelope Edward Hale gave her the night before. She still had not decided whether to accept it. Maybe that was why her chest felt strangely calm instead of nervous. Decisions mattered less once people stopped running from themselves. Across the ballroom, executives prepared speeches while assistants organized seating arrangements for international investors and reporters. Victoria Langford stood near the stage, speaking sharply into her phone, with visible frustration still shadowing her expression. Embarrassment aged certain people overnight. Daniel Ross noticed Claire near the hallway first. He crossed the ballroom immediately beneath the bright morning lights. You came. Claire looked toward the crowded room calmly. I said I would attend. Daniel smiled faintly. Half the executive floor assumed you disappeared again. Claire almost smiled. That would have been easier. Before Daniel could answer, the ballroom conversation softened unexpectedly near the entrance. Edward Hale had arrived. The chairman stepped into the ballroom wearing a charcoal suit with a dark overcoat folded over one arm, while reporters instantly straightened beside cameras and microphones. Yet instead of walking toward the stage first, Edward's eyes immediately searched the room until they landed on Claire near the hallway windows. He gave the smallest nod. Respect. Recognition. Not hidden anymore. Victoria noticed immediately from across the ballroom. So did everyone else. Claire remained still beneath the chandelier light, while the room subtly shifted around her once more. Some executives looked confused. Others suddenly remembered every careless thing they said to her downstairs the previous night. Edward approached calmly through the ballroom, while snow glowed softly beyond the windows behind him. "Good morning," he said quietly. Claire nodded politely. "Mr. Hale." He glanced toward the crowded press seating area. "You still call me that." Claire's expression softened faintly. "Habit." Edward almost smiled before offering her a thin black folder. "Open it." Claire accepted the folder carefully, while reporters continued preparing nearby. Inside rested a formal employment agreement with Hale Technologies. Senior Strategic Advisor, International Development Division. Claire stared silently at the document beneath the ballroom lights while the noise around them faded into distant blur for several seconds. Edward watched her calmly. "No pressure," he said softly. "Only opportunity." Claire closed the folder gently. "You really believe I belong back in that world?" Edward looked around the ballroom filled with executives, investors, and cameras beneath crystal chandeliers. "I believe this world belongs less to people who chase power and more to people who understand responsibility." His eyes returned toward her. "That is why I trusted you most." Before Claire could answer, one of the event coordinators hurried toward the stage announcing the press conference would begin in 5 minutes. Executives quickly moved toward reserved seating while reporters lifted cameras beneath the bright lights. Victoria approached Edward with visible tension still beneath her polished expression. "The media wants comments specifically about the Zurich correction issue." Edward nodded once. "They will receive them." Victoria glanced briefly toward Claire standing beside him. "And what exactly are we telling them about her involvement?" Edward looked directly toward the stage before answering calmly. "The truth." Victoria's face tightened slightly. Publicly, Edward finally turned toward her. "Integrity should not become private simply because it embarrasses executives." Silence followed immediately. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly before stepping away without another word. Claire watched her disappear into the crowd beneath the chandeliers. "You did not need to do that." Edward's expression remained calm. "Yes, I did." The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as cameras activated near the stage. Snow continued drifting softly beyond the towering windows, while Manhattan glowed beneath pale winter sunlight outside. Edward looked toward Claire one final time before walking toward the podium. "Come sit in the front row." Claire hesitated. "I am not part of this company." Edward's voice lowered gently. "Not officially." Then he stepped onto the stage beneath the bright conference lights while reporters immediately filled the room with camera flashes and raised microphones. Claire remained near the hallway for several seconds, holding the black folder carefully against her coat. Then slowly she walked toward the reserved seating area near the front beneath the crystal chandeliers. Conversations softened around her as executives watched quietly. Nobody mocked her now. Nobody interrupted. Daniel stood briefly to pull out the front row chair beside Olivia Hale before Claire sat down calmly beneath the lights. The press conference began moments later. Edward Hale stood behind the podium overlooking reporters and investors while snow reflected softly against the ballroom windows behind him. Before discussing the Zurich agreement, he said steadily, "There is someone this room deserves to acknowledge." Camera flashes immediately intensified. Edward looked directly toward Claire seated quietly in the front row. Last night, a critical translation error threatened this partnership before signing. Reporters began scribbling notes instantly. Edward continued calmly. The person responsible for identifying and correcting that error was not a senior executive, legal director, or board member. Silence spread carefully across the ballroom. It was Claire Bennett. Dozens of reporters turned immediately toward her beneath the bright lights. Claire remained composed despite the sudden attention surrounding her. Edward's expression softened slightly while standing behind the podium. 6 years ago, Claire Bennett protected Hale Technologies from one of the worst strategic mistakes in company history. The room grew quieter with every sentence now. Last night she did it again. No applause followed immediately because the moment felt too sincere for performance. Edward finally stepped away from the podium and looked directly toward Claire across the ballroom. "Some people spend their lives demanding respect," he said softly. "Others earn it quietly long before anyone notices." Snow continued falling beyond the Manhattan skyline, while crystal chandeliers glowed warmly above the silent room. Claire looked down briefly at the black folder resting in her hands before slowly lifting her eyes toward Edward once more. And for the first time in years, she no longer looked like someone hiding from her past. She looked like someone finally willing to be seen again.